On the morning of March 25, 1792, a crowd gathered in the Place de Grève expecting a clean, modern death. The guillotine, France's new national razor, promised a swift and egalitarian end. Its blade would fall on the neck of Nicolas Jacques Pelletier, a convicted robber. This was to be its public debut. The machine was designed for clinical efficiency, a stark departure from the messy, drawn-out executions of the past. Officials saw it as a triumph of enlightened reason over barbaric spectacle. Crowds were promised a quick, almost surgical procedure. The stage was set for a flawless demonstration of revolutionary justice. But the promise of a humane death collided with crude mechanical reality. When the executioner released the blade, it descended with a heavy thud. The cut was not clean. Witnesses reported a sickening crunch, not a sharp slice. The head was severed, but the act was gruesomely inefficient, requiring multiple attempts by the executioner to complete the grim task. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The assembled Parisians, hardened to public violence, were reportedly horrified by the machine's clumsy brutality. Some accounts describe cries of disgust, even a wave of nausea through the square. The revolution's symbol of merciful progress had, in its first outing, delivered a spectacle of butchery. The incident was a dark omen. It revealed that the sanitization of death was an illusion, and the age of public execution had found a new, unsettling rhythm. The guillotine was a failure of engineering, a mechanical blunder. But in ancient Rome, public execution was perfected as a form of mass entertainment. It was not a failure of the system, but its chilling success. The arena was the beating heart of this spectacle. It was not merely a stadium, but a meticulously stage-managed theater of death. Here, the condemned criminals, prisoners of war, slaves, and early Christians were not just killed. They were transformed into performers in a grand, brutal drama. Their deaths were scheduled, advertised, and performed before tens of thousands of cheering citizens. The methods were varied, designed to match the narrative of the day. A common criminal might be thrown to the beasts, a form of execution known as damnatio ad bestias. Wild animals, lions, bears, and leopards, imported from the empire's farthest edges, would tear them apart. Others faced the gladiator armed combat where the outcome was never in doubt. For some, particularly those convicted of arson, the sentence was burning alive. The crowd was not a passive witness, but an active participant. Their roars of approval or thumbs-down gestures could decide a man's fate in a gladiatorial contest. The atmosphere was one of festival, with food vendors and bookmakers operating alongside the bloodshed. To the Roman state, this was more than punishment. It was a powerful demonstration of absolute control, a graphic reminder of the empire's power to dispense justice and, perversely, a unifying civic ritual built on shared violence. The sand was soaked, the message was clear, and the applause was deafening. The guillotine, for all its flaws, was a product of the Enlightenment, a machine designed for equality in death. But in England just a century before, justice was not a machine, it was a man. And in 1685, that man was Judge George Jeffreys. Following the failed Monmouth Rebellion against King James II, Jeffreys presided over a series of trials known as the Bloody Assizes. His courtroom was not a place for deliberation, but for condemnation. The process was a brutal parody of law. Trials were swift, sometimes lasting only minutes. Jurors were threatened. Defendants, often simple farmers and laborers who had supported the rebel duke, were offered no real defense. Jeffreys' sentences were theatrically cruel. Hundreds were publicly hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment reserved for traitors. The condemned were hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled and beheaded. Their bodies were carved into quarters for public display in towns across the Southwest. The execution sites became grim spectacles, intended to crush not just men, but the spirit of resistance itself. Beyond the gallows, over 1,000 rebels were sentenced to transportation to the Caribbean colonies, a fate many considered a slower death sentence. Jeffreys reportedly boasted of the number he had killed. The Bloody Assizes served no real justice. They were an exercise in terror, a warning carved into them with rope, axe, and blade, proving that the most savage executions are not always the work of a mob, but can be administered from a judge's bench. The Bloody Assizes were a judicial horror, but in Paris 2 centuries earlier, law gave way to pure mob fury. This was not a courtroom perversion. It was a citywide slaughter sanctioned from the very top. On August 24, 1572, Paris awoke to the sound of church bells. They were not calling the faithful to prayer, they were a signal to begin killing. The target was the city's Huguenot population, French Protestants gathered for a royal wedding. What started as the assassination of a few Huguenot nobles, ordered by King Charles IX and his mother Catherine de' Medici, spiraled into a six-day frenzy. Catholic mobs, armed with everything from swords to cudgels, flooded the streets. The violence was intimate and chaotic. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Huguenots were dragged from their homes and murdered on their own doorsteps. Bodies were thrown into the Seine. The river, according to contemporary accounts, ran red. The killing was not quick or ceremonial. It was a massacre fueled by decades of religious hatred and political manipulation. Estimates of the dead in Paris alone range from 3,000 to 5,000. The contagion of violence did not stop at the city gates. The massacre ignited a wave of copycat killings across France. In the following weeks, perhaps 10,000 more Huguenots were killed in provincial towns. Paris had become a killing ground, not by the slow machinery of law, but by the sudden, explosive release of sanctioned rage. It demonstrated that the most terrifying executioner could be an entire city, mobilized by a single ringing bell. If the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was chaos made flesh, what followed was cruelty made policy. A century later, in 1757, Paris witnessed a spectacle of a different order. It was not the heat of riot, but the cold, deliberate machinery of state terror. The crime was regicide, an attempt on the life of King Louis XVI. The condemned man was Robert François Damiens. The sentence was not merely death, but a performance of agony designed to echo through history. The place to grieve was prepared not with a simple scaffold, but with a theater of pain. The sentence read aloud to the crowd was a legal masterpiece of horror. Damiens was to be subjected to what was termed the question, a series of tortures reserved for those who dared to touch the body of the king. His flesh was to be torn with red-hot pincers. Molten lead, boiling oil, and burning sulfur were to be poured into the wounds. The hand that held the knife was to be burned away. Only then, after hours of calculated suffering, would he be drawn and quartered by horses. The reality proved even the state's grim imagination inadequate. The pincers tore, but the man lived. The horses, 4 of them, strained against the ropes tied to his limbs, but failed to pull him apart. For hours, the executioners sawed at his joints instead. Through it all, witnesses reported Damiens crying out to God, but never to the king for mercy. He became, in his final brutalized hours, less a man and more a public lesson. A lesson written not in law, but in screaming nerve and breaking bone. The grotesque spectacle of Damiens' execution belonged to an old world of royal power and public pain. But a different kind of horror was brewing across the Atlantic, one driven not by a king but by fear. In the small, isolated village of Salem in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the year was 1692. The community was rigid, pious, and gripped by a deep anxiety about the wilderness at its doorstep. When young girls began suffering violent fits, the explanation was swift and terrifying. Witchcraft. A special court convened. The ensuing panic was a contagion, spreading from household to household through accusation. Neighbors denounced neighbors, old grudges settled under the guise of piety. The public executions were not elaborate tortures, but stark communal events. Gallows Hill became the stage. On June 10th, Bridget Bishop was hanged. She was the first. By September, 18 more would follow her to that hill. One man, Giles Corey, refused to enter a plea, knowing his estate would be forfeit if he did. His punishment was peine forte et dure, pressing beneath heavy stones until he died. A public execution by crushing weight meant to force a confession he never gave. The trials collapsed under their own absurdity when accusations reached the colony's elite. The hysteria broke, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. But the gallows had already done their work. The Salem witch trials demonstrated a chilling truth. The most efficient executioner is not a state, but a community turned against itself. The chaos of a single botched blade was replaced by something far colder. Following the execution of Damiens, the Enlightenment's thinkers had argued for a more humane, egalitarian method of death. The guillotine was their answer, a machine designed to kill without pain or privilege. But during the Reign of Terror, this symbol of rational justice became an instrument of industrialized fear. The system was brutally efficient. From the spring of 1793 to the summer of 1794, revolutionary tribunals processed accusations with assembly line speed. Denunciation was enough, the outcomes were preordained. Paris's Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, became a permanent stage. Tumbrils rolled daily from the prisons, carrying the condemned past silent crowds. The machine itself was painted red to hide its gruesome work. It was the scale and pace that defined the terror. King Louis XVI had been a singular event. Now the former Queen Marie Antoinette followed. Then came the revolutionaries themselves. Georges Danton, the fiery orator who helped ignite the terror, met the blade he had endorsed. His final words were a grim joke about showing his head to the people. It was, he said, well worth the seeing, the radical Maximilien Robespierre, who had sent so many to their deaths, finally faced the mechanism himself after his own arrest. The guillotine consumed its creators. This was not the mob violence of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This was death made bureaucratic, sanctioned by law, and delivered with chilling regularity. The very ideal of a swift, painless death was perverted into a tool for sustaining a permanent state of dread. The machine ran until the public, exhausted by the bloodshed, turned on the architects of the terror. The blade finally fell on Robespierre and the frantic pace slowed. But the model was now etched into history, a demonstration of how easily the machinery of justice can be retooled for the machinery of terror. The French Revolution's terror showcased a new, chilling logic: the bureaucratic elimination of the enemy within. This industrialized efficiency found a terrible parallel in the 20th century, where ideology and warfare fused on an unimaginable scale. The scene shifts from Paris in 1793 to Nanking, China, in December of 1937. The Imperial Japanese Army captured the city. What followed was not a battle, but a 6-week campaign of systematic annihilation. Public execution became a primary tool of terror. Soldiers used bayonets and swords for mass beheadings. They organized public shooting squads along the banks of the Yangtze River. Thousands of prisoners of war and civilians were assembled, bound, and machine-gunned into trenches they were often forced to dig themselves. These killings were not hidden. They were spectacles of dominance designed to break spirit through sheer visible volume. Historian Iris Chang's work, The Rape of Nanking, compiled witness accounts describing the river running red. Bodies clogged the waterways for weeks. The atrocities extended beyond execution to widespread torture and sexual violence, all conducted in the open. The intent was the total erasure of dignity and resistance. This was violence as policy, executed publicly to cement control. It represented a shift from the judicial theater of the guillotine or the Salem gallows to a raw, military-directed purge. The public square was no longer a stage for legal punishment, but a killing ground for ideological and racial supremacy, setting a grim precedent for the century to come. Transitioning from the mechanized horror of Nanking, a new ideology weaponized mass death not for war, but for a utopian vision. The Khmer Rouge, under Pol Pot, sought to create an agrarian communist society in Cambodia, starting in 1975. To achieve this year zero, they emptied cities, abolished money, and targeted anyone deemed impure. Intellectuals, doctors, teachers, even people who wore glasses were enemies of the state. The regime's security force, the Santebel, ran a vast network of prisons. Chual Sleng, or S21, was the most notorious. Here, over 14,000 men, women, and children were tortured, photographed, and forced to confess to invented crimes. But the final act was rarely private. Confessions extracted, prisoners were transported to execution sites outside the cities, known as the killing fields. Places like Choong Ek became factories for public death. To save bullets, guards often used farming tools, clubs, or the sharp edges of palm leaves. Music was blasted from loudspeakers to drown out the sounds. Families were often executed together, the children killed last to maximize the parents' anguish. These were not discrete events, but systematic communal slaughters witnessed by other prisoners and cadres. The ideology demanded the spectacle as proof of the revolution's purity. The bones and fragments of victims' clothing still rise to the surface after heavy rain. A grim harvest from a regime that turned the soil of its own country into a mass grave. This was ideology made visceral, where abstract concepts of class and revolution demanded concrete public bloodshed. The mechanism has changed, the audience has not. The guillotine and the gallows are museum pieces. But the public square remains a stage. The camera now performs the function of the crowd. An execution posted online reaches millions in seconds. It demands a witness. It creates a shared horrified communion. The psychology is ancient. Public death is a message. It is a demonstration of power. It is a warning written in a language everyone understands. The body itself becomes the billboard. This spectacle evolved. It moved from the physical arena to the digital one. The visceral shock is the same. A public hanging in Tehran or Pyongyang serves the same purpose as a beheading in the Roman Forum. It binds the community through a collective, sanctioned horror, it says. This could be you, yet it also asks a darker question of the viewer. Why watch? Morbid curiosity is part of it, a grim affirmation of being alive. But also a deep, often unacknowledged, need to see justice or injustice rendered in the open. To verify the finality, to see the story end. The last public execution by guillotine in France was in 1939. A man named Eugen Weidmanns. The crowd's behavior was so unruly, so ravenous for a glimpse, that the state banned public executions thereafter. The problem was not the killing, it was the spectacle. The modern world has not abolished that spectacle, it has simply changed the channel. The video uploads, the view count climbs. The ancient theater is now a screen glowing in a darkened room.